So hi everyone and welcome in today's webinar. I'm George Boretos from QBRM and together with Nico Bacharidis from Global, we will be presenting the ideal tender excellence journey, including some industry benchmarks from the life sciences market. Before we proceed, some webinar logistics. The webinar will be recorded and the recording together with the slide deck presentation will be sent to you after a few days. You will be notified with a separate email. The presentation itself will take approximately 45 minutes and we'll leave in the end almost a quarter of an hour for some questions. Actually, you can use the Q&A button. Please don't use the chat button of Zoom. So the Q&A button of Zoom to ask any question. Let's proceed now with a few introductions about the two speakers. I'm George Boretos. I'm the co-founder and co-CEO of QBRM. QBRM is a highly specialized software vendor, and we offer an end-to-end tender management software suite covering all aspects of tendering, from discovery to qualification, response preparation, evaluation, approval submissions, everything in there, including a 360 view and monitoring of your sales performance and tender process efficiency. In order to do so, we are using state-of-the-art technologies like natural language processing in order to identify relevant tender opportunities and machine learning in order to offer some optimum price suggestions and also to estimate your chances of winning each and every tender. And I'm handing over to Nico to also introduce himself and Growpal.
Thank you very much, George. I'm Nico. As George was saying, I'm the founder and CEO of Growpal. At Growpal, we are working on tender and contracting processes and capabilities and tools and everything around this topic of tender and contracting, partnering now for many years with QBRM. I have a background in the pharmaceutical industry. I've been with Pfizer for over 13 years. And a big part of that time, I had the opportunity to build up and then lead the global tender and contracting team at Pfizer. So this is a bit where my background and my experience on the topic is coming from. Looking forward to the webinar this afternoon, and back to you, George, for the next couple of slides.
Thanks, Nico. So let's proceed with the first section of our presentation, including the identified most important factors of success in your tender excellence journey in the life sciences market. In order to identify these important driving forces, we did a workshop together with Nico and Growpal before a few months during the 10th EPP Life Sciences Pricing Forum in October 2021 in Munich. In this workshop, we had 35 participants, mostly people from tendering, pricing, market access, and other relevant functions from both pharmaceutical companies and medical technology companies. So representatives of the life sciences market, and mostly from big companies of the market. We analyzed everything using our 7 steps for success framework for tendering. We'll talk about it in a minute. And the key objective of the workshop was to identify what is the ideal tender excellence journey and what are the most important factors of success in this journey. And this is the framework of analysis that we used. And actually, this is a common sense process that you can use in almost all markets, not just the life sciences, but in almost all markets. We start almost in all cases in tendering from the obvious thing to discover new tender opportunities. Yes, in the past, we used to just read the newspapers to do so, and now we connect to online tender sources, but fundamentally we're doing the same thing. We're trying to identify what are the most important and the relevant tender opportunities out there. But identifying a relevant tender opportunity is just the first step in the process. The second step is to prioritize all these opportunities and understand for which one you should go ahead and pursue them, and for which one you should skip them. Because imagine that even if you have a relevant tender opportunity and you have the products for this opportunity, if you know that there is a lot of competition and there will be a fight out there and your chances of winning are very, very low, then perhaps you should skip it. or if you know that you could win this tender, but you have to lower your price and profitability a lot. So perhaps it's not an appealing tender anymore. And again, perhaps you should not go after it. All these things and many other criteria can be used in order to prioritize all the different tenders and eventually qualify or disqualify some of them and decide for which ones you should skip them and for which ones you should pursue this specific tender opportunity. But once you have decided that you want to pursue a specific tender, then obviously you need to start preparing for the specific tender and evaluating your chances of winning the tender, identifying the best possible price, and eventually, once everything is done, then you need to internally get your approvals in order to submit the tender, and then in the end, you wait. You wait until this tender is awarded either to you or to someone else in the market. But regardless of the outcome, you need to have some sort of tender governance, so to keep track of the awards and outcomes, competitive intelligence, and monitor your sales performance and also your tender process efficiency in order to get better and better and improve yourself at each run of the tender cycle. So these are our 7 steps for success in tendering framework, and this is what we use in order to analyze everything in tendering and the most important factors in tendering during the workshop. And these are the results of the specific workshop. What you see here are the most important factors of success as identified during the workshop in descending order of importance. Actually, the initial list was a lengthy list including more than 40 different elements, but if you would check this list thoroughly, as we did, you would immediately identify that some of these elements can be grouped together under more important, bigger underlying forces or themes. And these forces or themes are presented here again in descending order of importance. And starting from the most important ones, we have tender discovery, of course, and obviously. If you don't know your universe of relevant tender opportunities, obviously you are missing a lot, so you should excel on this aspect. And of course, we have planning ahead, being able to anticipate new tenders before their official publication and plan ahead and prepare for these tenders. This was also identified as one of the 2 most important factors in tendering excellence. And then you have a series of very important factors that have to do with award tracking, of course, competitive intelligence, obviously it's extremely important, pricing, predictive intelligence was also identified as something very, very important to identify chances of winning and optimum price for a tender. It's very, very important, of course. And in the end, after you have a successful tender, in order to be able to track down the contract, its life cycle, and its fulfillment through different stages was also identified as something very important. And then you have a series of, let's call them second priority, important but second priority elements and themes that mostly have to do with the process efficiency with teams, project management, collaboration, supporting elements like document management, things like that. If you think about it, the most important elements have to do with the sales effectiveness and the sales performance. These are elements that can move the needle in terms of revenue, profitability, and tender visibility. This is why they are so important. And then the second priority themes have to do with the process efficiency, with the effective collaboration, with all the supporting things that we do in order to eventually excel in our tendering. So all these are important. They have to do with our efficiency in pursuing tenders, but these are the most important elements because they have to do with our effectiveness and our sales performance in the end. But this is just one dimension, that of the strength and importance of the specific element. Let's put now another dimension. So we have the importance, as we said before, of all these elements. And here we have the coverage of the tender cycle, or in other words, in how many steps of the tender cycle all these different elements are present. And the big question here is, are elements that are more often used or seen or present within across the tender cycle the most important ones? So is there any correlation between the tender cycle coverage, and the importance of each and every element? And the answer is a big no. Because if you see here a couple of examples, you see here that the most important driving forces, tender discovery and planning ahead, they're only present in just one or two steps of the tender cycle. However, they are very, very important, the most important elements actually. And here you have the series of very important elements, and you can see that some of them, like contract management and awards, are only present in just a couple of steps of the tender cycle, whereas some other, like the competitive intelligence and pricing, are almost everywhere present. So the answer is definitely that there is no significant, at least, correlation between the presence or how often we see a specific element through and across the tender cycle and its importance. And having said all that, let's put another dimension to this analysis, which is what's the current status of the market at all these different, or most of these different elements. And for that, I'm handing over to Nico again in order to analyze the market and help us understand what's the current maturity status of the life sciences market in terms of tendering excellence. Nico, you have the stage.
Perfect. Thank you, George. Good. Now let's have a look at this second dimension, right? George was talking about the importance of the steps. Now let's have a look at the maturity, or in other words, where do we stand as a life science industry when it comes to tender capabilities? And of course, it will be interesting for you also to benchmark yourselves versus the market and see how you're doing against your peers. So that's the idea of the next couple of slides. Now, how did this work? So we were using this tender maturity assessment. A lot of you have actually participated in this, so you know what it is. It's 24 questions, self-assessment questions, along these 7 tender phases that George has just described to you, in order to identify and understand how do you score yourselves across this tender journey. And what you will see now is basically the consolidated, anonymized results of the whole life science industry. So who participated and who did we ask? As George was saying, it's pharma and medtech companies, and a lot of the biggest and the top pharma and medtech companies have participated in this journey. Also, if you look at the functions, who did we actually ask? We believe we asked definitely the right people, the right functions, because we asked a lot of global tender leads, tender managers, pricing colleagues, market access colleagues, and commercial excellence colleagues. So the right sample of people. However, still, I think it's fair to say this is an individual assessment. So of course, this is subject to some also personal opinions and perceptions and views. Nevertheless, we believe this is a good benchmark and gives us a very strong direction. In terms of company size, as you can see, 2/3 of the companies were very big corporations, over 10,000 employees, 1/3 up to 10,000 employees. So this is basically the mix, the sample that has participated. Now, we will talk about these 3 different categories. We're talking about a reactive, a coordinated, and a strategic type of tender management. This is based on the score from the self-assessment. If the score is between 0 and 40, it's in reactive, between 41 and 79 in coordinated, and over 80 in strategic. So what does that mean? That means if you're in the red, that means you're managing tenders in a reactive, often even in an emergency type of way. That means you're not planning ahead systematically. Maybe your planning horizon is 3 to 4 weeks only, and there is very little coordination and alignment between the countries. Then the next category or the next level is the coordinated, where a lot of aspects are already working well. Your planning horizon on tendering is expanding, And also you're starting to see across countries and starting to coordinating and align across different countries. And then, of course, the strategic one. This means on a global level, you have an overview of the next 9 to 12 months. You see what are the biggest tender risks and the biggest tender opportunities that are coming your way. And you're managing those strategically and proactively. That's the blue part. To give you even a bit more flavor what these three areas mean, because we're going to talk about them for the next couple of slides. Again, you have these two important dimensions. You have the level of planning on the horizontal axis, right? So you have emergency type of planning, which is only 2 or 3 weeks ahead. And you have the more strategic planning, which is 9 to 12 months or even beyond that. And then on the vertical, you have the level of coordination. Local means it's just basically every country by itself, and there's no global oversight or regional oversight. And then there is some regional coordination and even global coordination. So what does that mean? That means if you are in the emergency and local quadrant, then a lot of bad things can obviously happen, right? I mean, you can have late submissions because you are basically running behind the tender. This could lead to out-of-stock situations. This could lead to penalties or to suboptimal pricing because you don't have the time to really analyze the situation and make a right pricing decision. Or maybe also because you're not knowing what the price in one country might impact the price in other countries, especially if the prices, for example, are public. So this happens in this reactive stage. Then, of course, the better you start planning and the more you start to align, then things are starting to improve. So you can, for example, improve your customer value proposition and your messaging towards the customer. But of course, this needs some time. You can start improving your supply, managing your out of stocks, decreasing your penalties. And of course, also in the area of pricing, the more time you have, the more information you can gather, the better overview you have, the more strategic and better your pricing decisions will become. And then the last part is the strategic part, the strategic area that we are all aiming for, where you start to proactively shape the environment and shape tenders, where your pricing gets sophisticated and you start even using predictive pricing methods, where your volumes, your supply is aligned globally and allocated globally, and where you can even start looking at cost of goods optimizations, starting to understand, okay, if we win or lose these volumes on the regional and global level, what does that do to my cost of goods and to my competitiveness in the bidding? So these are the three areas: the reactive, the coordinated, and the strategic. Now, how does that look like? This is the broad overview. And what you can see here on top, as a life science industry, we are at the moment at 62%. You can see that some companies are in the reactive category. The big part is in the coordinated part. And then there is a couple of companies, a handful of companies who are already in the strategic area. You can see that this differs, this contribution differs slightly across the 7 phases. And we're going to deep dive into all of these phases, right? But you can see, for example, that in evaluation, there seemed to be much less in the strategic stage. In the submission, there seems to be a much bigger part in the strategic phase. What we've done here, because the coordinated part was so big, so broad, we added basically, or we basically split up this coordinated category into low coordinated, which is between 40 and 60%, and the high coordinated between 60 and 80. Because it gives some additional insights. So for example, if you look at the evaluation stage, you could argue strategic is only 6%, but also the high coordinated is 50%. So overall, the evaluation phase might not be that bad after all. Or the other example, in the governance stage, you could say, okay, 22% of the companies are already strategic, but then only very few are in high coordinated. And actually the big part of companies is doing this reactively or at the very low coordination level. Good. So what we're doing now in a minute is really going phase by phase and see what that means. Oops, here we go. The next slide that we wanted to show you is the comparison between large companies and smaller companies, right? So in blue, you have the companies over 10,000 employees, in orange, under 10,000 employees. And what you can see here is that across all the 7 steps, the bigger companies are scoring higher. So that's one of the first findings that we have. Of course, one interpretation is if you have a big tender and contracting revenue, of course, then it's easier to justify dedicated resources, dedicated tools, dedicated processes. And that might be one driver why the bigger corporations are a bit more mature in this than the smaller corporations. The second big finding, if you look at this is the overall score, there is a huge distribution within the life science industry. Actually, from 29%, so some companies are rating themselves at 29% maturity, up to 88% maturity, which is very strategic and and really in the area of tendering excellence. So within the same industry, there is a huge distribution of where the different companies are standing at the moment. We also had a look at the variability between the different phases. So here again, the percentages are the averages across the phases. And then we had a look at the highest 20% of companies and the lowest 20% of companies to understand a bit the ranges here. And you can see the ranges are quite broad. The lowest one is in submission. The highest range, the highest variability is in the governance phase. One interesting point was also that within the same company, there were very different ratings. So for example, in the same company, it could be that discovery was rated really low, qualification high, preparation low again, etc., etc. So it doesn't mean if a company rated themselves low, it was across the board. That means you did this assessment in a very differentiated way, which is good because, as George was saying, every company has their own journey. And if you're really finding out where your strengths and weaknesses are, then this helps you to tackle this in a much more customized and targeted way. Now let's go through the different steps and see the maturity assessment here. So we start obviously with discovery. And again, here you see a huge spread. The lowest company scoring themselves at 30, the highest at 90% when it comes to tender discovery. And the majority of the companies in this coordinated phase. So if you go one level below now and look at some of the actual questions that we asked, not all of the questions, but we picked what we think the most interesting ones for you. And of course, one key question is this one. We anticipate the tenders to be published for the next 9 to 12 months and prepare for them. As George was saying, this scored the highest or amongst the highest in terms of importance. So how does it do in terms of maturity? And it's a bit of a split view because there are some companies that are managing this in a strategic way, but over than half of the companies are rating themselves reactive or low coordinated. So even though it is the most important thing, according to the workshop and your feedback, only half of the companies are really advanced when it comes to maturity. The other one that scored even lower was we have access to and gather competitive intelligence systematically. Here, none of the companies rated themselves as strategic, only 17 at highly coordinated, and a huge majority reactive and low coordinated. So this seems to be an area with a lot of room for improvement. And also in terms of importance, competitive intelligence has scored fairly high as well. Let's now move on from discovery to qualification. So this is the area where we prioritize and select the right tenders to bid on. What you can see here, the spread is even higher between the lowest and the highest. It's from 27 up to 93%. We see here a bit more companies assessing themselves as managing it strategically. Of course, here the key underlying question was this one. We are deciding systematically and strategically which tenders to pursue and which tenders to focus on. And then we do our resource allocation accordingly. We see here that around half of the companies rating themselves high in terms of really focusing on prioritizing and picking the right tenders, but still around half rather low, and 1/3 of it really in the low reactive phase as well. Now we go to the preparation phase. Here again, quite a big spread from 30 to 85. So now let's have a deeper look what lies behind this. And one of the key questions or the key challenges was around analytics and gross to net. So the question was, do you have all the analytics to prepare your optimal gross to net strategy and your pricing strategy? And again, here, only 11% are managing this strategically. And actually over half of all the companies are struggling with this one. So this was definitely a sub step that was kind of pulling the maturity level rather downwards. And let's go to the evaluation. Similar picture here, quite a big spread again between the lowest companies and the highest. Here we are just showing one of the questions, but there are several questions below that. So what we've seen in this area, that most companies are using bidding scenarios, and most companies are having a big focus on optimizing supply. So the out of stock and the supply reliability challenges that we had in the industry over the last couple of years, they seem to have had an impact, and a lot of companies are focusing on that. Where companies rated them rather low was in pricing and in cost of goods optimization. We picked this one question here for the presentation, which says we are always able to identify the right offering and the optimum price to maximize the revenue potential and the profitability. I mean, as you know, in tendering, it's always about finding this sweet spot between the profitability and the probability to win. So here we see that none of the companies have rated themselves 80% or higher. Around 39% high coordinated, but the majority of companies rated themselves rather low when it comes to this, again, quite important aspect of the tendering process. Going now to the approval. This is quite an interesting one, because here we have, I think, the biggest spread, the lowest rating themselves at 25% only, but there are also some companies rating themselves at 100% when it comes to this approval step. So what's behind the approval? It's actually quite interesting. So the first question was, can you ensure approvals from all relevant functions? And here there is a fairly high confidence or a high maturity that the right approvals can be ensured. The follow-up question was, do you have a tailored automated process for this? Do you use multiple criteria? And here the picture looks quite different. Here only 17% are doing this in an automated way, and the vast majority, there seems to be some room for improvement when it comes to automation and efficiency around approvals. Then the submission part, again here quite a wide spread, and as well a couple of companies rating themselves at 100% when it comes to tender submission. And then the last step is the governance step, which is interesting because it shows the lowest maturity of all the tender phases, and it goes from 23% up to 90%. And it's actually such an important phase. I mean, as George explained, if we want to continuously improve, we need to learn every cycle, and we need to collect all this information and get better and better. But this seems to be quite a challenge for a lot of companies. If we look at this here, we ensure all possible intelligence and know-how is stored and accessible. It doesn't sound like rocket science, right? But then still, 50% are in reactive, right? And only 7% or 17% are in low coordinated. And you know, sometimes I think a bit this is because it's at the end of the process, you won or lost a tender, and then your daily business catches up with you, and you forget to track, and you forget to do the governance part, which is actually quite a simple part that doesn't take too much time. It's mainly, do you win, do you lose, who was the winner, what was the right price? And by doing this continuously, you can actually build also a lot of net pricing intelligence and competitive intelligence, which is another important factor. Very good. So I think, George, I went through all the phases. And now what George is going to do is wrap this all up, also combine the importance with the maturity, with the readiness, and then come up with a couple of key takeaways. So George, back to you.
Thank you, Nico, for sharing all these interesting insights. Now we understand more or less where the life sciences market stands in terms of tender excellence. And it's somewhere in the middle, let's say an average status. As Nico presented, the average overall score for all the different steps of the tender cycle is around 60%. And this is what you see here, different elements, different factors of success with their importance, what we presented in the first section, and also the corresponding score of readiness. So how well we perform right now in the market. Obviously, an average score, and obviously within each and every market, you see many companies with different scores, but that's the average, more or less, situation over there. Now, what we see here, there are some surprises and some things that we were expecting. Yes, we were expecting that most of the scores will be average. We don't see any spectacular scores here. Some are well below the average, actually, but we don't see anything well above the average. What we see, especially for the most important elements, for instance, the planning ahead, the tender discovery, if you remember, they were the most important ones based on the workshop that we did. And as you see, the score in terms of readiness, as Nico presented, just slightly higher than the average. So nothing spectacular. And this is obviously a surprise because you have imagined that most companies should have invested a lot of time, at least, in order to focus on those important elements, which they recognize as very important elements of success in order to excel on those two things, but they are not. This is not Excel. This is just an average performance. And yes, this is a surprise. And the same for another two important elements like capturing awards, exactly what Nico captured in the end of his presentation, pricing, all these things are very important. But again, they just score slightly higher than the average. But the big surprise was this circle over here, those three elements, the predictive intelligence, the contract management, and the competitive intelligence, which score high in terms of importance. These are very important elements of success. However, they score well below the average of the market. So this is where companies should have invested a lot because these are important. However, they have not disinvested, but they have neglected a bit or a lot. And this is an important finding. On the other hand, and this is again a surprise, you can see some medium importance elements, all the things that relate to the efficiency of the process, teams, collaborations, things like that, mostly at least. And here is where we score not extremely high, but at least higher than the average. So if you try to interpret all these results, the combination of the standard status of the current status of the market in terms of readiness and tender maturity versus the importance, it seems like, and again, it's just our interpretation, there might be other interpretation as well. However, it seems like companies have achieved the first 60% of tender readiness by doing the simple things, the easy targets, the quick wins, which is normal and should be expected. But that means that the most important things and the things that are the most challenging and most impactful in our business performance are left to be done. And partly they are neglected, like predictive intelligence, contract management, and competitive intelligence. But even those elements, like planning ahead, tender discovery, that are not neglected, again, we don't excel there. Again, our performance is not spectacular. So this is a big finding, and that means that, yes, we might be, let's say, on the almost on the midway of or halfways or in our tender excellence journey. However, the remaining half is challenging and more impactful for our overall business. Now, if we try to sum everything up, because we've said a lot and understand that is overwhelming, it's a lot of information to assimilate in just 1 hour, less of 1 hour, actually. There are a couple of key takeaways that are important. First of all, a lot of diversity between companies. Yes, we presented averages, but these are not 100% written in stone norms that you should follow all of the times. Again, these are just directional insights. I mean, the average statistics that we presented that are interesting, are a great starting point, just an inspiration for your internal discussions. But in the end, each and every company, it's a different case. You see how diverse their scores were, from 29%, which is low, to 88%, which is extremely high, strategic. So you do understand that each and every company needs to draft your own strategies and find your own path to tender excellence. And yes, right now, there is an average status in the market, but again, it seems like what we have achieved, the life sciences companies, I mean, they have achieved the easy things and the most sophisticated ones, which are the most challenging ones, but also the most impactful ones in terms of revenue increasing, profitability, won rates increasing, all these important things. They are either neglected or at least we don't excel there. So they are left for the remaining part of the journey. So the remaining half of the journey, it's not actually half. It might take more time. It's a bit longer than it seems. And there is a potential for improvement in all aspects, at all fronts, at all different steps and elements within the steps of the tender process. This is obvious. In all the important things like tender discovery, planning ahead, predictive intelligence, competitive intelligence, there is a lot of space, a lot of room for improvement. And that means that there is a lot of room for improvement in your business performance as well. So this is good news, actually. It needs hard work. It needs some investments and to take initiative, obviously. But this is great because there is a lot of potential to improve your business performance as well. And there are a couple of cases we presented that were, let's call them outliers, or at least they stand out, like tender discovery and planning ahead, extremely important, not neglected, but not overinvested. And we don't excel on them, we should. Also, the predictive intelligence part, it is the holy grail of tendering to understand or anticipate what is the pricing of our competitors and what should be our right price to win this tender or maximize our profit and our pricing. And we don't do anything there. This is partly neglected in most cases and it's extremely important. And the last part that was mentioned by Nico repeatedly, it's governance. I mean, in the end, the whole end game of the tender excellence journey is what? To be able to control and monitor 360, to have a 360 view of everything related to your tendering process and your sales performance. Everything should be great. And you should have full governance of whatever is happening within your tendering business. And this is not the case right now, because as we've seen, one of the lowest scores, actually the lowest tender maturity score in the market is right now governance. And it's not a surprise, again, because usually when you haven't done a lot, you don't have a lot to govern. When you do more and more things and you incorporate more steps and more elements within your new initiatives and you start improving them, then you have more to manage, and obviously governance becomes more and more important. But it is important because this way you can get better and better in each and every tender, after each and every tender, after each and every tender cycle. So a very important market with many challenges, but a great potential to improve from here in the following months, years, or whatever the duration of your investments would be. So I'm pausing here, and we are ready to receive questions. Let me check if we have anything. Yeah, actually, we have a lot. I'm just reading through to pick up the best to start. I think that, Nico, I have one for you. You presented a graph with the scores of companies and the comparison between the bigger and the smaller companies. There is someone from the audience that says, okay, since bigger companies score better than the other companies, that means that what you present is relevant just for big companies, and for smaller ones, it's a lost case.
Thanks for the question, George. The simple answer is no, I don't think so. I don't think the size of the company should be the main driver or any driver here. It's more how big is the tender and contracting share compared to your overall business. Is it only 10%, or is it 30 or 40, or is it 70, like in some medtech companies? And this should, of course, be the main driver. How important is this to your business? And also, is it growing? Is it a growing channel or not? Right? And we've seen in all the channels that we're looking into that this is a growing channel. I think the tender and contracting share mostly is driven by two things. One is your portfolio, right? If it's more a generic biosimilar vaccine type portfolio, of course it's higher. However, we also see trends of more and more tenders in the patent protected space as well. I think the second thing, apart from portfolio, it's probably geographies, right? I mean, in some countries it's fully tendered, in others it's smaller, but those two things normally drive how big your tender and contracting share is. And I think that the tender and contracting share should guide your prioritization. So I've also asked myself, why then do we have this very clear difference between bigger and smaller companies? And I think, of course, if your absolute tender and contracting revenue is higher, it's easier to justify dedicated investments into resources and processes and tools, right? In other words, if your tender business is $1 billion and you improve it by 1%, that means 10 million revenue improvement. That justifies a lot of investment and a lot of dedicated resources, and it might make your business case a bit easier. However, as I said, I think size should not be the driver. It should be the relative importance of the tender business to your overall business. I hope this answers the question, George.
I think so. Actually, you mentioned something about regions and difference between countries, and there is a question which I think is very, very relevant. Mm-hmm. It says that do you find some countries to be easier or more difficult regarding tendering? Are there differences or not?
I think there might be actually really countries where it might be a bit easier. I think the question is also always a bit, what is a good tender, an easy tender, or what is a bad tender or a difficult tender, right? And the way I look at it, a bad tender is a tender where you only have a couple of weeks or days to respond. A bad tender is if there is no room for interaction or value proposition. You know, if it's just price, winner takes it all, huge amount of administration. So there are some components, if you combine them, you get a difficult or a bad tender environment. On the other hand, of course, a good tender is if you have enough time to respond, if there is actually a room for discussion or a value proposition, if the award criteria are more balanced, maybe there are multiple winners to manage the risk and ensure supply, etc. So there are different elements that make it easier or more difficult. And you see differences in markets. That's why it's also, I think it's important to archetype your markets. And then based on your market archetype, you might need different capabilities to actually address it. So the simple answer is yes, there are definitely differences. And there are countries where it's a bit trickier and more difficult than in others.
Thanks, Nico. I'm reading a following question, another question. It's a bit big, so I will read it through. We are using certain online tender sources in each country, which are completely different, and each country also has a different mindset for tendering. So how can you in the end manage to have control, maintain control, and have an overview of such a diverse process? Nico, if you allow me, let me take this one, but because I think it has to do with technologies eventually. This is exactly what we are doing. So we know exactly the complexity of handling and managing, especially online tender sources, which are almost completely different within the same country when you have more than one sources, but also cross countries. And when I say different, is different UI, technologies, content, product categories, taxonomies, search capabilities. I mean, everything is different. But in the end, especially if you have a regional responsibility for some countries, you want to have an overview of all the tenders coming from all the various sources. And if you have them localized, I mean, someone from the local affiliate, for instance, accesses the information from each and every online tender source at each and every country, obviously, you don't integrate them, you don't consolidate them, and you don't have an overview of your business, just bits and pieces of the information. So you are not there. Definitely, you are not excelling in tendering in consolidating the information. So, for instance, what we have done, and this is an example of enabling technologies that can unify this information for our customers. When we have many countries involved in a deployment, usually this is the case. We absorb all this complexity with our technologies because this is what we do. We go electronically and we have developed, or we can develop connectors for each and every online tender source. And this does two things. First of all, electronically, we connect in order to fetch the information into our system. But that's not the only thing that we do. Also, we unify information. So for each and every online tender source, you have a data set, let's say, of information that they cover. We have a superset of all these pieces of information. And depending on the online tender source, we know which bits and pieces of this information we need to consolidate. So instead of being in touch, let's say, and disturbed, annoyed by the diversity and differences of all these different online sources, eventually you see just one thing, just one system. So the reason that I'm mentioning that is to answer the question. You can do that, and you can maintain everything into one place and have an overview of your business, regardless of the complexities and the localized differences, which are many, but you need technology, you need the system. There is no way that you can do it if you have just a process of people getting information into an Excel file and they try to unify, etc., etc. This is extremely difficult. It can be done, but this is one of the examples where technology is mandatory and not just helpful. So I hope I answered that properly. I see that we have some other questions, so I will read through. The next one is actually one of the biggest things that we mentioned before. So someone from the audience asks that one of the biggest challenges that they have is to try and identify the right price for each and every tender, obviously. So the question is there a way that we can fix that? Because obviously we don't know our competitors' prices. How does this work? So this is important. This is important. And actually, this is exactly what we said before about the predictive intelligence over here. This is a common problem, so please don't feel alone in this. This is a common issue for most companies. And again, the holy grail of tendering is to figure out what are our competitors' prices, based possibly on past historical data or any other information that we have. Sometimes we just have instinctive information coming from our salespeople. Can it be fixed? Yes, it can be improved. Can it be fixed 100%? Obviously not. We're not oracles. We cannot just forecast the future. We can forecast a potential future using predictive analytics. So there are technologies that can help us with tendering to identify the right pricing. However, in tendering, we have some unique characteristics that make this exercise a bit more difficult than it is in the retail world or in the B2C world. In tenders, we have, first of all, quality criteria that blur the picture of pricing, because it's not just pricing. Also, you have to consider the qualitative part, because it's part of the scoring process. And also, usually, we don't have big data. We don't have even small data, or in some cases, we don't have any data at all. Imagine a tender that it is unique, for instance, just happened once, or a tender that happens every 1 year or 2 years. So usually you don't have a lot of data. But you need to have something. You need to estimate something. There are models. This is actually what we do, which are heavily specialized for tendering, and they take into consideration these peculiarities. Let's say the quality part of the tender and also the lack of a lot of data, and they can help. Again, are they bulletproof? Obviously, they are not, but can they improve our performance? Yes, tremendously. And the more data that we bring into the system, as we use a system and we have a common repository, let's say, for award information, pricing information, the better the performance gets through time. So it can definitely be improved, although it cannot be fixed 100%. So I still see that we have 3 minutes. So I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. Nico, I think this is for you, and it's very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
You talked about the important factors of success. However, what's the most important thing? To have or hire the right people, to have the right processes, or using the right technologies? A nice one.
It's a nice one, indeed. The initial reaction is you probably need all 3, plus a couple of other things. Of course, it starts with the right people. I think the important thing is to have somebody really dedicated to the topic. I think if you have somebody who is doing tendering 20% on top of their normal job, I don't think a lot of things will happen. And in the end, it is a bit of a change management project as well, because you're implementing new processes and new tools and new capabilities, and you need somebody to really drive this. So you need a dedication, you need somebody who's resilient, you also need some continuity, because if after a year the people change, it's tough to implement it, right? So it starts with having the right people and dedicated people that are willing to pull this off and pull this through. Then I think we all, also in my experience, starting with the process is important. A cross-functional process that also basically manages a bit when do the functions come in, when does manufacturing come in, when does pricing come in, when does marketing come in, because in the end tendering is a team sport and you need to manage that team and you need to have a process around it, right? But then I think technology is here to support the process end to end, right? I mean, if you look at the 7 steps that you presented, I think technology can play a part in all those 7 steps if it's done in the right way. So definitely technology plays a huge role in facilitating this process. Hope this answers the question.
I think so. I think so. So thanks, Nico. Unfortunately, we don't have any other time. It's just 1 minute that we have. So let's quickly wrap it up. And again, thank you for attending the webinar. It was a great pleasure to present with Nico all these important insights. We hope that they were helpful and they will help you start and inspire your internal discussions and find your own internal path to tender excellence. And we want to wish you, first of all, to be well and safe in these troubled times with COVID and everything. And of course, great success in your tender excellence journey and improving your performance. So from me, Nico, from QBRM and Global, again, thank you so much for attending the webinar. So bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.